There are certain moments in true crime where looking back, everything feels obvious. But in real time, nobody sees it. Neighbors wave, friends hug, families post smiling photos online. And sometimes, the person responsible for something unimaginable is standing right there in front of the cameras, pretending to be devastated. Tonight's story begins in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Frederick, Colorado. Tree-lined streets, freshly cut lawns, kids riding bikes before sunset. The kind of neighborhood where people leave their doors unlocked. But on the morning of August 13, 2018, one house on Saratoga Trail became the center of one of the most disturbing true crime stories in modern American history. Because inside that house lived a man named Chris Watts. And within just a few hours, his entire family would vanish. At first, he told everyone the same thing. He had no idea where they went. But what happened next would expose a lie so chilling that millions of people watching the news felt the exact same thing. Something about him felt wrong. From the outside, Chris Watts looked like the definition of an ordinary family man. He worked as an oil field operator for Anadarko Petroleum. His wife, Shannon Watts, was active on social media and frequently posted about their life together. Photos showed birthday parties, family dinners, vacations, and their two daughters, 4-year-old Bella Watts, 3-year-old Celeste Watts. To anyone scrolling through Shannon's Facebook page, it looked like the perfect life. But behind those posts, things were beginning to crack. Chris had grown distant. Friends later said Shannon confided that her husband seemed withdrawn, distracted, almost like he had mentally checked out of the marriage. What she didn't know was that Chris had started seeing another woman. Her name was Nicole Kessinger. The relationship had started quietly. Text messages, secret phone calls, meetings when Shannon was out of town. And as the weeks passed, Chris began to imagine a completely different life. One without his wife, without his kids. But ending a marriage is one thing. What Chris Watts chose to do instead would shock the entire country. On the morning of August 13, Shannon's close friend, Nicole Atkinson, started to get worried. Shannon had missed a doctor's appointment. She wasn't answering her phone, and that was extremely unusual. So Nicole drove to the Watts house. She knocked on the door, no answer. But Shannon's car was still sitting at the driveway. Inside the car were the children's car seats. And that's when Nicole made a decision that would change the investigation. She called the police. When officers arrived, Chris Watts came home shortly afterward. He seemed calm. He told police Shannon had taken the girl somewhere. Maybe a play date, maybe a friend's house. He wasn't sure. But as officers looked around the house, something felt off. Shannon's phone was still inside. Her purse was still inside. Her medication still inside. And there were no signs of a struggle. The investigators asked the neighbor if they could check something. The neighbor's security camera. Inside the neighbor's house, they watched footage from earlier that morning. The video showed Chris backing his truck into the driveway, something he rarely did. And while the footage didn't show exactly what was happening, Chris stood behind the officers watching it, arms crossed, barely speaking. The neighbor later said something that investigators would never forget. He turned and whispered, "Something's not right with him." Just one day later, Chris Watts appeared on local news, standing outside his home, pleading for his family to come home. He looked straight into the camera and said something that millions of viewers would watch over and over again. "If they are out there, just come back." He talked about how much he loved them, how he wanted his girls back, how the house felt empty without them. But something about that interview bothered people. The way he smiled at odd moments, the lack of emotion, the strange body language. Online viewers began picking apart every second of the footage, and slowly suspicion started building. Because while Chris Watts was on television begging for his family to return, investigators were already uncovering a completely different story. A few days later, Chris Watts agreed to take a polygraph test. He sat in a small room with investigators, wires attached to his chest, a blood pressure cuff tightening around his arm. The examiner asked simple questions. Did you harm your wife? Did you harm your daughters? Do you know where they are? Chris answered calmly, no. But when the test ended, the examiner leaned forward and said something blunt. He had failed. Badly. At that moment, the entire tone of the room changed. Investigators told Chris the truth. They knew he was lying, and they weren't leaving until they got the real story. Minutes passed. Chris sat silently. Then he began to cry. But the story he told next still wasn't the truth. Chris first claimed that Shannon had harmed the children. He said he walked in and saw it happening, and in a moment of rage, he killed her. But investigators kept pressing him because the timeline didn't make sense. The evidence didn't match. And eventually, the real story began to emerge. In the early morning hours of August 13th, after Shannon returned from a business trip, Chris attacked her inside their bedroom. She never had a chance to defend herself. Then, in a horrifying series of events, he placed his daughters in the truck. Still alive, he drove nearly an hour to an oil worksite owned by Anadarko Petroleum. And there, investigators later discovered what happened next. The case would horrify even experienced detectives. The bodies of the girls were hidden inside the massive oil storage tanks. Shannon's body was buried in a shallow grave nearby. The motive? Chris Watts later admitted he wanted a completely new life, a fresh start, without the responsibilities of the family he had built. The case moved quickly through the legal system. Facing overwhelming evidence, Chris Watts eventually pleaded guilty. In November 2018, he was sentenced to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. He is now serving those sentences at Dulles Correctional Institution. And even after the sentencing, the case continued to fascinate and disturb the public, because people kept asking the same question. How could someone who appeared so ordinary commit something so monstrous? Was there a warning sign? A moment where someone could have seen it coming? Or was Chris Watts simply living a double life so convincing that nobody around him realized the danger until it was too late? True crime stories often leave behind more questions than answers, and this case is no different. A quiet neighborhood, a smiling family, two little girls who trusted their father completely, and a man who looked into a television camera and asked the world to help find them, even though he already knew exactly where they were. Sometimes the most chilling mysteries aren't about strangers hiding in the dark. Sometimes they're about the people standing in the light. This has been the Dark Abyss Podcast. If you enjoy deep dives into true crime stories that reveal the darker side of human nature, make sure follow the show so you never miss an episode, because the next story might be even darker.